Welcome back, brothers, to Warhammer. Tonight we're diving into the lore of the galaxy sectors in Warhammer 40k. Before we get into that, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank guys for support. I've been absolutely killing it. Now, let's get into the video.
Men speak too easily of sectors when they speak of the Imperium, as if the dominion of mankind were a map that could be folded, indexed, and filed away in some dust-choked archive vault of the administratum. They say sector as though that single word were sufficient. They say sector as though a realm of 1,000,000 worlds might be reduced to neat lines of ink on parchment skin, to the cold glow of a cartolith display, to a clerk's notation in a ledger carried by a bent-backed adept whose eyes have long since rotted behind augmetic lenses. It is not so. It has never been so. The Imperium of man is not divided into a handful of orderly sectors. It is broken first into the 5 vast segmenti majoris, and only beneath those immeasurable regions do the sectors begin to take shape, and beneath those sectors the subsectors, and beneath those the systems, and beneath those the worlds themselves. That is how the Imperium names the darkness. That is how it pretends the darkness can be governed. Even this is only half true, for imperial space is not a thing measured by distance alone. It is not enough for a world to be marked upon a chart and declared within the Emperor's light. A border means little if the warp route through it is blind with storm, if the currents of the immaterium have soured, if the navigators see only madness, where once there was a road of pale fire. The Imperium is geographic only in the most stubborn and material sense. It is navigational in every way that matters. A world may lie close in the void and still be farther away than 1,000 stars if no sane vessel can reach it. Another may sit on the far side of a gulf-swept wasteland of black space, yet remain bound to terror by old and stable passages through the sea of souls, by astropathic ducts that throb with whisper and command, by pilgrimage roads trodden by the living and the soon-to-be dead. Thus, the Imperium does not merely rule worlds. It rules lanes, tides, anchorages, translation, points, beacon lines, and prayers. It rules whatever can still be reached. At the highest level stand the segmenti majoris. Beneath them lie the sectors. Beneath the sectors lie the subsectors. Beneath the subsectors lie the systems. Beneath the systems lie the worlds, each one burdened with its own tithe grade, its own feudal obligations, its own chains of command, its own shrines, manufactoria, hive stacks, ash deserts, death pits, cathedral cities, and graves. This hierarchy is not elegant. It is not efficient. It is the bone cage built around a thing too vast to hold. The Adeptus Terra, the Departamento Munitorum, the Administratum, the fleet offices, the tithe clerks, the chartists, the relay keepers, the astropaths, the customs adepts, the missionaria galaxia, and the endless scribal castes of the Imperium all require levels of command, because no single mind, no council, no dynasty, no machine short of a god engine of bureaucracy could ever hope to comprehend mankind's empire as a whole. The Imperium survives by division, because total comprehension died long ago. What remains is categorization, and what cannot be categorized is too often abandoned. All roads in this labyrinth of jurisdiction and ritual still curve, by law and by myth, around terror. At the throneward heart lies segmentum solar, the core, the old cradle, the most sacred and most burdened region in the Emperor's domain. To the galactic east sprawls Ultima Segmentum, vast beyond easy reckoning, swollen with frontier empires, old bastions, and long war fronts. To the south lies Segmentum Tempestus, a furnace of naval movement, martial musters, and grinding campaigns. To the north broods Segmentum Obscurus, where the shadow of nightmare lengthens across the Emperor's chart. To the west stretches Segmentum Pacificus, where distance itself becomes a tyrant, and where isolation can be as deadly as invasion. These 5 are the great regions of the imperial idea of the galaxy. They are the monumental falsehood that permits lesser truths to function beneath them. They are not lies because they are wrong. They are lies because they suggest order. Each segmentum bears its own organs of war and command. There are segmentum authorities, segmentum records, segmentum tithing structures, and above all, segmentum fleets, for the Imperium is ruled as much by voidcraft as by governors. Decrees mean nothing without troop ships to enforce them. Tithes mean nothing without cargo hulls to bear them. Faith means nothing without pilgrim flotillas carrying it from shrine world to shrine world. Even the wrath of the Emperor must travel in convoys, in battle groups, in battle fleets, in the solemn thunder of warships whose keels are older than dynasties. Thus each segmentum possesses not merely a name upon the map, but a naval heart, a fortress, a fleet base, a bastion from which orders issue and to which the wounded, the victorious, the desperate, and the condemned alike must one day return. Mars broods over Solar as forge and fortress both. Cypra Mundi stands watch in Obscurus. Hydrophor anchors Pacificus. Bacca endures in Tempestus. Cardunius holds command in Ultima. These names are not mere locations. They are pressure points in the body of the Imperium. They are where authority hardens into steel. Yet authority does not move through real space alone. To understand how the Imperium is divided, one must understand that every border is haunted by the warp. Battle fleets cross the dark by the grace of navigators who dare open their third eye to the tides of the immaterium. Merchant convoys drag grain, promethium, munitions, pilgrims, indentured laborers, servitors, machine parts, and regiments across impossible distances through hell-lit corridors. Crusades burn from one segmentum into another, not by the simple thrust of engines, but by a chain of translations, safe passages, guest passages, and desperate passages through a realm where thought has teeth. Astropathic choirs scream messages into the Empyrean and wait for half-mad echoes to return. Orders, pleas, warnings, denunciations, calls to muster, invoices, casualty returns, censure notices, and martyr rolls all cross the galaxy upon that same diseased medium. The arteries of the Imperium are not roads of stone or void lanes of fixed certainty. They are wounds through unreality, lit only because the Astronomicon still burns from terror like the funeral pyre of reason itself. That is why a map of the Imperium always lies. A chart can show the 5 segmenti majoris with all the dignity of sacred geometry. A chart can show sectors bounded and named, subsectors grouped, systems indexed beneath heraldic seals and sigils of authority. It can show trade routes in delicate lines and crusade paths in martial red. It can even mark the pilgrim roads and fleet corridors on which 100 generations have trusted their lives. But a map never shows the true weight of things. It does not show the hive world, whose population has swollen beyond count, where the underhive has become a nation of cannibals and rad-scarred mutants beneath the boots of those above. It does not show the agri-world whose harvest ships have not come in 3 generations because the warp lane collapsed and the people now eat seed grain and prayer books. It does not show the shrine moon drowning beneath processions of the faithful while plague rots in the hab warrens behind the basilicas. It does not show the star fort hanging silent on the edge of a system where all life has been bled away. It does not show pirate corridors, Xenos kill zones, dead worlds still marked productive because no clerk has lived long enough to amend the record, or fortress systems that have become tombs manned by men whose descendants no longer know why they were posted there. The lived reality of the Imperium is congestion, starvation, devotion, rust, artillery smoke, vox static, processionals of the doomed, the droning of catechisms, and the ache of waiting. Somewhere a governor sends a tithe fleet under escort and receives no answer for 20 years. Somewhere a battle fleet arrives a week too late to save a forge world that burned for a month. Somewhere, an astropath dies vomiting blood after passing on the last coherent warning from a subsector already lost. Somewhere, a shrine route remains clear and prosperous for 1,000 years, only to collapse overnight into a corridor of demonic light when the warp changes its humor. Somewhere, a world loyal beyond measure waits centuries for relief, because on the chart it is merely one world among untold millions, a notation, a tax mark, a line item in a universe of delayed response and ritual neglect. The Imperium looks orderly because it has had 10,000 years to perfect the appearance of order. Survival is another matter. This truth has only sharpened in the latter years of the 41st millennium and beyond. Administratively, the 5 segmenti remain, the seals remain, the records remain, the offices remain, the clerks remain, bent over data slates and skin scrolls beneath lumen globes and icon racks. Sector lords still claim sectors, subsector commands still issue decrees, segmentum fleets still carry their ancient names. Nothing has changed, says the paperwork. Everything has changed, says the galaxy. For when the great rift tore itself across the heavens, when the cicatrix maledictum bled open through the body of the night, the old map ceased to be sufficient, even as fiction. The empire of mankind was not merely troubled, it was practically sundered. On one side lies Imperium Sanctus, still lit by the Astronomicon, still clinging to a wounded continuity. On the other lies Imperium Nihilus, where the Emperor's light falters, where whole regions grope through nightmare without the certainty of beacon or reinforcement, where worlds vanish into silence, not because they have fallen, but because no one can any longer hear them scream. This is the reality that every later chapter of the galactic story must reckon with. A segmentum is not simply a region of stars. It is a mode of suffering. It is an expression of pressure. It is a style of endurance. Solar is not merely the center. It is the crushing weight of proximity to the throne. Obscurus is not merely the north. It is the long habit of staring into the mouth of damnation and calling that vigilance. Pacificus is not merely the west. It is distance made into policy, abandonment refined into administration. Tempestus is not merely the south. It is war conducted as industry. Ultima is not merely the east. It is scale swollen to absurdity, where empire frays into frontier and certainty dies by increments. The Imperium names them as regions because the human mind demands compartments. History knows them as different masks, worn by the same decaying colossus. To speak of the division of the galaxy, then, is to speak of how mankind wages war against its own helplessness. The segmentae majoris are not triumphs of governance. They are admissions of limit. The sectors beneath them are not proof of mastery. They are attempts to count what cannot be truly held. The subsectors, systems, and worlds beneath that chain of command are not beads on a rosary of dominion. They are isolated points of faith and labor connected by hazard, by custom, by memory, and by the terrible persistence of institutions too vast to notice individual ruin. The Imperium governs because it must. It governs badly, because nothing on this scale could be governed well. It endures because collapse is slow, because habit is strong, because fear is stronger, and because every generation is taught that duty matters more than understanding. So when you look upon a chart of the Emperor's realm, do not ask only where one segmentum ends and another begins. Ask instead which routes remain open. Ask which fleets answer the call. Ask which astropaths still dream true. Ask which worlds send their tithe, which worlds send only bones, and which worlds send nothing at all because no one remains to raise the vox or light the beacon. Ask what price is paid to keep a line on a map from becoming an obituary. Ask what lies buried beneath every neat designation of sector and subsector, for beneath every line is distance, Beneath every distance is risk. Beneath every risk is the warp. And above all of it, enthroned in ash and sanctity, lies terror. If the map of the galaxy is to be understood at all, it must be understood from the throneward heart, where all lines of command pretend to meet, where every fleet oath is ultimately sworn, where every tithe is justified, where every lie of unity is wrapped in gold and incense and offered up as truth. There, at the center, all roads still attempt to converge. There, all records claim meaning. There, all prayers rise whether answered or not. To understand how the Imperium divides the galaxy, one must begin where the Imperium believes all things begin and all things end. One must begin with terror. There are worlds in the Emperor's dominion that men still dare to imagine as blessed. There are shrine worlds drowned in incense and hymnals, garden worlds hidden behind noble bloodlines and inherited lies, fortress worlds whose defenders claim that no enemy has ever stood upon their soil and lived to boast of it. Terra is not one of these places. Holy Terra is not a paradise. It is not a jewel. It is not the promised summit of human civilization, preserved against the long rot of the age. It is the most sacred world in existence, and for that very reason, it is also the most burdened, the most suffocating, and the most consumed. Pilgrims dream of it as the final destination of devotion, but those who live beneath its smog-choked vaults and auramite towers know it as pressure without end. Every stone is holy, every corridor is watched, every institution weighs upon every other until the whole planet groans beneath the mass of its own significance. Terra is not merely the throne world of mankind. It is a temple the size of a planet, the seat of the Adeptus Terra, and the wider machinery of imperial government, and the center around which Segmentum Solar and the rest of human space are made to turn. That is the truth of Segmentum Solar from the very first breath. It is the core of imperial space, the most ancient and densely settled region under human rule, and the place where every strand of the Imperium's authority knots itself into something almost impossible to separate. Religion bleeds into bureaucracy. Bureaucracy hardens into military command. Military command borrows the language of sanctity until war itself becomes liturgy. Symbolic power and practical power devour one another here until they are the same thing seen through different candle smoke. To stand within Segmentum Solar is to stand where decrees are written as acts of faith, where fleets are mustered in the name of salvation, where tithes are extracted with all the solemnity of sacrament, and where the idea of the Imperium is maintained by endless institutions that no longer remember where ceremony ends and necessity begins. It is the foundation of mankind, yes, but foundations are buried, crushed, and unseen, and all that stands above them leans with terrible weight. Terror sits at the heart of this region, like a relic cased in iron and human misery. The imperial palace sprawls across the world in impossible enormity, more a continent of walls, sanctums, halls, towers, and defensive works than a single seat of rule. Within it lie the chambers of the High Lords, the sanctified bureaucracies of the Adeptus Terra, the procession ways of pilgrims who have come across impossible distances for one glimpse of the end of all roads, and at the innermost heart, the golden throne itself, where the Emperor endures beyond life, beyond death, beyond every sane definition of either. This nearness to the throne is the root of all prestige in the Imperium. To be summoned to Terra is to be marked by significance. To serve in its orbit is to be wrapped in reflected glory. To hold office in its shadow is to stand closer to the center of mankind's faith than nearly any soul in the galaxy. Yet that same nearness is a sentence as much as it is an honor. The closer one stands to the throne, the more eyes fall upon him, the more enemies gather in silence, the more ruthlessly any failure is remembered. The servants of Terra are elevated by proximity, but they are also consumed by it. And if Terra is the spiritual and political heart of Segmentum Solar, then Mars is the red iron lung that keeps that heart from finally failing. It is a grave world, a forge world, a shrine world of the machine god, and a bastion without which the Central Imperium would collapse into paralysis. Men who speak loosely of Mars, as though it were merely Terra's neighboring sphere, understand nothing. Mars is no satellite to human glory. It is one of the true pillars on which the Imperium rests. Its forge complexes, manufactorums, and orbital works feed the insatiable appetite of the Sol system. Its priesthood maintains rites of machine reverence older than most living empires. Its void docks hang above the equator in colossal arrays, and from them, cargo, war material, and vessels of every sanctioned class are raised and lowered in quantities so immense that the mind rebels against them. Mars is also the Segmentum fortress of Segmentum Solar, the fleet anchor of the region, and the home of Battlefleet Solar, that immense concentration of naval strength, whose presence alone makes the central reaches of the Imperium seem inviolate to those foolish enough to trust appearances. The Sol system around these twin-world shrines is less a planetary neighborhood than a fortified nexus of history and concentrated dominion. Terra and Mars form its blazing centers, but Luna hangs there also, deeply. Inhabited and deeply bound to the defense and ritual life of the throne world, beyond them lie ancient stations, watch bastions, dock rings, relay points, and the old architecture of a civilization that has spent 10,000 years stacking guns, shrines, archives, and command echelons atop the birthplace of its species. The system includes mining and industrial worlds, fortified moons, the asteroids and belts worked by labor castes and machine thralls, and the outer reaches guarded by stable warp routes whose control matters as much as any wall or weapon battery. At its edges stand star forts and layered defenses near the Mandeville points. Within it, patrol monitors, minefields, hunter servitors, system fleets, and every breed of sanctioned guardian necessary to screen the approach to Terra. There are enough defenses in Sol to erase lesser stellar empires from history and still leave room in the docks for fresh squadrons. Yet safety in the Imperium is always a matter of comparison, never of truth. Segmentum Solar may be the best defended and most densely settled of mankind's great regions, but that does not make it gentle. It makes it crowded, suspicious, and merciless. Purges do not cease because the throne is near. They intensify. Rivalries do not lessen because every institution claims to serve the same master. They sharpen into vendetta, censure, and silent annihilation. Tithes are not lighter in the Emperor's shadow. They are more relentless because the needs of the center are without end. Pilgrim traffic does not soften the soul of the region. It crushes it beneath a constant tide of desperation, awe, disease, fraud, and devotional hunger. There are worlds in Solar where wealth enough to sustain a dozen sectors changes hands behind sealed chambers while Hab populations choke on ration ash and devotional slogans. There are void docks where generations are born, labor, and die without ever seeing open sky, if sky still means anything to those raised beneath reactor glare and station iron. This is the safest part of the Imperium, only in the sense that it is the place where oppression has had the longest time to perfect its methods. To live in Segmentum Solar is to learn how power truly moves in the Emperor's realm. It does not move only through edicts and heralds. It moves through fleet musters, signed by the proper seal and delayed by 3 conflicting chains of authority before a cruiser's engines ever ignite. It moves through decree upon decree, descending from the Senatorum, the Administratum, the Munitorum, the fleet offices, and 1,000 subdepartments whose clerks must all be obeyed if a regiment is to receive its ammunition or a convoy its escort. It moves in pilgrim floods that wash into Terra by the million, in black ships bearing psychers to their terrible destinations, in merchant columns dragging food, promethium, replacement parts, devotional items, munitions, and gene screen personnel across prescribed routes. It moves through astropathic choirs that burn out their minds to send warning, censure, requisition, and plea. Imperial rule is not a still thing seated upon a throne. It is motion, mass, schedule, convoy, writ, and fatigue on a civilization-wide scale. Segmentum Solar reveals this more nakedly than any other place, because nowhere else is the throughput of empire so concentrated. For all that, holiness never ceases to drape itself over ruin. That is the central image of Solar. Endless cathedra rise over crumbling service ways. Processional avenues shine with icons, while the maintenance ducts beneath them leak heat and poison. Palace walls soar with impossible grandeur, while the bodies required to sustain the machine of state are fed, spent, archived, or incinerated by the uncounted millions. Mars chants its Binharic hymns over furnace mouths and sacred data vaults, while rust, entropy, and ancient compromise gnaw at the understructure of everything. Luna and the greater web of stations, docks, bastions, and corridors around Terra glitter with disciplined purpose, but even there exhaustion is the true fuel. The center of the Imperium does not run on certainty. It runs on labor beyond counting, on inherited procedures no one dares question, on faith reinforced by fear, and on institutions too immense to stop even when they begin to fail. In Segmentum Solar, the pageantry of the Imperium is at its most glorious, and the practical decay beneath that pageantry is at its most undeniable. Then came the Great Rift, and any illusion that the core might remain untouched by the wider collapse of the galaxy died screaming. The old Thronewood hub did not become calm while the rest of the Imperium burned. It became the anchor of Imperium Sanctus, the comparatively more stable half of a broken empire, still within the light of the Astronomicon, and therefore still capable of a degree of cohesion denied to the night-shrouded reaches beyond. Terra remained the seat. Segmentum Solar remained the core. Mars remained the fortress and fleet hinge. The seals, commands, and processes all endured, but endurance is not peace. Warp travel remained dangerous. Bureaucratic paralysis remained endemic. The wider strategic burden only deepened, for the center had now become both bastion and launch point, trying to hold what was left, while also hurling fleets and crusades outward toward worlds swallowed by darkness. Imperium Sanctus is the stronger half only by the cruel arithmetic of the age. It is still an empire on fire, merely one that can still see the flames by the Emperor's light. So Segmentum Solar is indeed the heart of the Imperium. It is the Thronewood core, the oldest concentration of human power, the region where Terra and Mars hold between them the spiritual and material poles of mankind's dominion. It is the place where the Imperium's symbols are strongest, its fleets most concentrated, its bureaucracies most labyrinthine, and its hypocrisies most complete. But the heart is never the whole body, and the body of the Imperium is diseased in more ways than one. To understand Solar is to understand how mankind preserves authority through ritual, density, fear, and momentum. It is to understand how the center survives by burdening everything around it. It is to understand why countless souls still crawl toward Terra in hope, even though hope is the one commodity the throne world can least afford to honor. Yet Solar, for all its magnitude, does not teach the final lesson. It teaches only how the Imperium sustains itself at the center. To learn what it fears, one must leave the Thronewood blaze and go north, where vigilance hardens into obsession and the dark between worlds is filled with older, harsher promises. One must turn from the crushing sanctity of Solar toward the haunted marches of Segmentum Obscurus, where the Imperium's maps begin to resemble wounds more than dominions, and where mankind has long measured survival not in prosperity, but in how many times it can endure the same nightmare and still call itself unbroken. Segmentum Obscurus is where the charts of the Imperium begin to look less like instruments of governance and more like the after-action records of an endless campaign. In Solar, the map still pretends at majesty. In Solar, the lines of command and the old borders of authority can still be dressed in the language of permanence. But in Obscurus, every line seems drawn under duress. Every notation implies a warning. Every cluster of worlds appears less like a province of empire than a defensive problem waiting to erupt into catastrophe. Here the Cartolith does not speak of order without also speaking of siege. Here the void is marked not merely by trade lanes, tithe routes, and anchorages, but by breach points, kill zones, bastion systems, shrine corridors, and the long shadow of places where the materium has never fully healed. If Solar is the administrative heart of the Imperium, then Obscurus is the clenched jaw, the scarred shield arm, the sleepless eye turned northward into a darkness that has known mankind's name for 10,000 years, and spits it back in hatred. It lies north of Terra, upon the ancient reckoning of the Imperium's galactic divisions, and though the language of North means little in the cold vastness between the stars, the orientation remains useful, because all roads of thought in the Emperor's realm are still forced to bend around Terra. Thus men say North, and by that word they mean dread. They mean the haunted marches, the embattled sectors, the worlds raised not for prosperity, but for endurance. They mean the regions watched over by veteran fleets, whose commanders inherit caution as surely as they inherit rank. They mean the great military gravity of Cypra Mundi, the segmentum fortress of Obscurus, a fleet capital raised not for splendor, but for function, discipline, and retaliation. Cypra Mundi is not revered because it is beautiful. It is revered because it endures. Its docks, command bastions, relay structures, arsenal vaults, and naval offices form one of the Imperium's hard counterweights to the madness beyond it. It is a place where information is gathered, where battle groups are rearmed, where void losses are tabulated into fresh orders, and where the abstract word vigilance becomes steel, fuel, gunnery solutions, and deployment schedules. It does not dream of peace. It prepares for the next alarm, and over all of Obscurus hangs the eye of terror. No understanding of this segmentum can begin anywhere else. The eye is not simply a region upon the map, not simply a dangerous anomaly through which hostile fleets emerge. It is a spiritual wound in reality, a bruise upon creation so vast and ancient that whole generations have been born, fought, and died under its influence without once beholding its light directly. It defines the mood of Obscurus, even where its fleets are not present, and its war bands have not yet struck, because its existence alone has taught the segmentum what kind of universe it inhabits. It is the reminder that damnation is not metaphor. It is the proof that blasphemy can possess geography. It is the place where the warp does not merely intrude, but reigns, and from which the servants of the dark gods have launched invasion after invasion against the worlds of men. In other reaches of the Imperium, chaos may be discussed through sermons, denunciations, inquisitorial decrees, and the fearful symbols of forbidden texts. In Obscurus, chaos is a direction. It is a pattern of fleet deployment. It is a strategic horizon. That truth has shaped the entire character of the segmentum. Obscurus is a land of fortress worlds, shrine systems, bastion moons, redoubts, reserve anchorages, and populations trained by history to expect the next warning flare to herald extinction. Its worlds grow hard because softness is punished. Its fleets grow old in battle and do not retire from the burden of experience, because every captain who survives long enough becomes a repository of caution the Imperium can ill afford to lose. The people of Obscurus are taught resistance almost as soon as they are taught prayer, and often the two are the same lesson. On some worlds, the great cathedrals are also strong points. On others, the processional roads are built wide enough to bear armor columns when the alarms sound. Ammunition bunkers lie beneath reliquaries. Anti-orbital silos stand in the shadows of statues to saints and martyrs. Fortress walls are carved with litanies, not because that is beautiful, though it is, but because in Obscurus, piety and preparedness are fused into the same civic instinct. This has happened not through theory, but through repetition. The history of Segmentum Obscurus is written in invasions endured, frontiers broken and rebuilt, crusades launched in desperation, sectors bled white, and worlds elevated to legend through the scale of their suffering. Black crusades have surged from the eye across the ages, each one leaving behind a fresh pattern of ruined systems, martyr rolls, broken fleets, and oaths of vengeance that outlived the men who swore them. Whole regional identities have been built from this long habit of loss. Some worlds define themselves by having held, others by having been raised and reclaimed, others by having furnished regiments and ships until their own populations were hollowed out in the effort. Resistance in Obscurus is never merely tactical. It becomes lineage, it becomes doctrine, it becomes the central myth by which a world tells its children why the dead were spent and why the living must be ready to join them. There are sectors whose cohesion depends less on trade than on inherited memory of the last great invasion. This is why chaos in Obscurus can never be reduced to a theological abstraction. It is not only the enemy named from the pulpit, it is a military reality, a psychic reality, and a logistical reality. It corrupts supply routes. It distorts astropathic communication. It taints the confidence of the common citizen and the calculations of admirals alike. A regiment sent to reinforce a frontier world may find its destination changed by warp turbulence, arriving months too late or years too early by the clocks of those who wait. A fleet may hold its battle line against traitor vessels, only to discover that the true damage was done in the minds of its own crew, in whispers spreading through the lower decks, in dreams shared by men who should never have dreamed the same dream. A shrine world may continue its rites, even as the reliquaries crack and bleed. A governor may find that the greatest threat to his sector is not the visible enemy at the border, but the slow contamination of morale, record-keeping, and trust. Chaos in Obscurus is not only an assault from without, it is corrosion from within, always probing the joints of a defensive structure already burdened by age and fear. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the border zones, those regions where the line between military frontier and sacred geography ceases to exist. In Segmentum Obscurus, worlds do not remain one thing for long. A bastion world becomes a reliquary, because so many have died upon its walls that the soil itself is venerated. A shrine world becomes a fortress, because devotion alone no longer keeps the enemy from orbit. A grave world becomes a propaganda symbol, because the Imperium requires memory to be useful, even when it is tragic. The names of fallen planets are recited in sermons. Their ashes are bottled into Saint Dust. Their defense lasers are rebuilt and reconsecrated if the ground can be reclaimed. Their losses are painted onto murals and void shields alike. Every mile of border becomes layered with meaning until strategy, religion, mourning, and statecraft become impossible to separate. In this way, Obscurus resembles Solar, while also standing as its opposite. In Solar, power becomes sacred because it is close to terror. In Obscurus, sacredness becomes militarized because the enemy is always near. Then the galaxy split wider still. When the Great Rift tore open the heavens, Segmentum Obscurus did not merely suffer another campaign or absorb another blow. Large parts of it were swallowed into the wider nightmare of Imperium Nihilus, where the light of the Astronomicon could no longer be relied upon, where communication degraded into fragments and silences, and where time itself became treacherous. In such regions, the old assumptions of central command began to die. A world could not wait for orders from Terra if no order could arrive. A fleet could not rely upon reinforcement timetables if translation through the warp turned chronology into mockery. An astropathic choir might cast its warning into the dark and receive no answer for months, or receive an answer from a command structure already dead by the reckoning of real space. Survival became regional rather than central. Systems clung to subsector capitals. Subsector capitals clung to fortress worlds. Fortress worlds clung to whatever fleets remained. The larger map endured in ink and memory, but in practice, Obscurus became a patchwork of strongholds, blind corridors, lost marches, and islands of endurance adrift in the dark. And perhaps that is the truest lesson this segmentum offers the Imperium. Obscurus teaches that there is no permanent defensive line. There are only pauses between catastrophes. No gate holds forever. No bastion remains untested. No victory secures the frontier beyond the span of its fuel reserves, ammunition stores, and the stamina of the men ordered to stand the wall one day longer. The Imperium has spent 10,000 years fortifying Obscurus, and still the wars return. It has built star forts, consecrated shrine systems, armed reserve fleets, sanctified martyr worlds, raised generations on hatred of the foe, and named every fresh rampart a bulwark against final night. Yet the darkness never ceases to press. Every line becomes a salient. Every bulwark becomes a target. Every hard-won reprieve invites the dangerous fantasy that this time the border may truly hold. Obscurus exists to punish that fantasy. It exists to remind mankind that endurance is not the same thing as security. So yes, Segmentum Obscurus is a fortress of faith at the edge of damnation. It is the northern reach where Cypra Mundi coordinates retaliation, where the eye of terror defines the emotional weather of entire provinces, where fortress worlds and shrine systems alike are raised with one eye on heaven and one eye on the void. It is the realm of veteran fleets, siege-bred mentalities, martyr cults, and regional identities forged in repeated loss. It is the place where chaos is not a distant doctrinal enemy, but a nearby and recurring fact. It is where the Imperium's sacred geography becomes indistinguishable from its military frontier, and where the age of Imperium Nihilus has made every surviving pocket of order feel local, temporary, and dearly bought. But the galaxy does not end at the scream of the eye, nor does uncertainty wear only one face. To understand the wider shape of mankind's suffering, one must turn away from the north and look westward, beyond the blazing wound and the old habits of siege, toward another vastness altogether. There lies Segmentum Pacificus, where the threat is not always the sudden hammer blow of invasion, but the slower tyranny of distance, thin oversight, and the long, cold spaces in which worlds can be forgotten long before they are conquered. There are regions of the Imperium that terror announces with a clear voice. In some reaches, the enemy is so obvious that even a child could point to the wound upon the chart and name the source of dread. Segmentum Pacificus is not such a place. The western vastness does not declare itself through one singular horror, one immortal scar in reality, or one infamous gate through which damnation marches in parade formation. Its cruelty is slower than that, and in many ways more revealing. Pacificus is the tyranny of distance. It is the exhaustion of command stretched thin across far-flung worlds. It is the dilution of central power as it travels outward from terror through layer upon layer of order, delay, interpretation, neglect, and misfortune. Here the map does not seem cursed so much as overextended. The lines run longer, the certainty grows thinner. The spaces between one reliable bastion and the next open wider until a man begins to understand that in the Imperium, remoteness is not safety. It is merely a slower road by which ruin arrives. Segmentum Pacificus lies west of Terra, and its segmentum fortress is Hydrafur. But those facts alone do not convey what the region truly is, which is a test of how long empire can endure once its center is too far away to be felt as anything except law, memory, and myth.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
Hydrafur stands at the heart of that contradiction. It is a forge world, an administrative capital, and a fleet capital all at once. A single world burdened with too many sovereignties and too many obligations to belong wholly to any one master. Its orbit bears the immense star fort ascendant and shipyards that ring the world in iron utility, serving as the fleet base for Segmentum Pacificus, even if, in the practical truth of naval life, many of the ships theoretically assigned to that command will spend years or decades anywhere but their supposed home. On the world below, the Imperial Navy, the Ecclesiarchy, and the Adeptus Mechanicus all hold their spheres of power in uneasy conjunction, and that alone makes Hydrafur a perfect symbol of the wider Imperium. Nothing is simple. Nothing is unified except in decree. Everything functions through compromise, pressure, inherited privilege, and the threat of catastrophe if the wrong institution chooses the wrong hour to obstruct the others. Hydrafur exists to keep the western reaches from drifting apart, and in doing so, it reveals how much effort the Imperium must expend merely to preserve the appearance that its provinces remain parts of a single realm. This is why Pacificus feels like the segmentum of patrol lines and convoy schedules more than of grand myth. Other regions are remembered for wounds in reality, for legendary crusades, or for frontiers where faith and terror meet blade to blade. Pacificus is remembered in another register. It is remembered in manifests, in shipping records, in delayed orders, in casualty tallies for escort squadrons ground down by attrition far from celebration or notoriety. It is remembered in the long wake of merchant columns making their way along established routes under the eyes of understrength naval screens. It is remembered in dock rings where crews disembark, hollow-eyed and half-deaf after years in the void, and in austere bridge decks where admirals make life and death decisions with incomplete augur returns, compromised astropathic reports, and old intelligence already rotten by the time it reaches them. In Pacificus, imperial power often appears not as a glorious host descending from heaven, but as paperwork struggling to become action before events outrun it. The segmentum lays bare the fact that empire is not held together by banners alone. It is held together by scheduling, by shipping, by repair capacity, by fuel, by escort tonnage, and by the willingness of exhausted men to obey one more order on the faith that someone, somewhere, still sees the whole. That is the Western frontier mood at its most honest. The charts stretch outward into less certainty, and with less certainty comes thinner oversight. There is more room for piracy there, more room for local magnates, mercantile dynasties, ambitious governors, and petty tyrants to flourish in the cracks between official attention spans. There is more room for a subsector to become inward, looking for a star system to think first of its own granaries and defense monitors before it thinks of terror, for a world to learn habits of self-preservation that can be praised as admirable loyalty one century and condemned as suspicious independence the next. The West is still the Imperium. Its tithes still rise. Its fleets still swear by the throne. Its priests still preach the same creed. Yet all of this is filtered through the old truth that authority weakens with travel time. A seal from terror remains potent in law. In practice, its force depends upon who can carry it, who can interpret it, and whether there is enough void strength available to make obedience more rational than defiance. Pacificus is what happens when the Imperium's claim remains vast, but its reach arrives by relay, by convoy, by seasons of waiting, and by the patient cruelty of administrative lag. There, more clearly than in many other regions, one sees the true weakness of the Imperium. It is not only that mankind has enemies in every direction. It is that it cannot answer every threat at once, even when it knows the threat exists. The galaxy is too broad. Routes fail. Ships require repair. Astropathic messages arrive garbled or late. Lords dispute jurisdiction. Fleets are committed elsewhere. A governor petitions for aid and receives forms, censure, or silence. A convoy goes missing, and no one can spare the hulls to investigate until the losses begin to affect some larger chain of supply. A pirate kingdom can grow teeth in the dark between major patrol lines, because the nearest battle group is 2 months away by the most optimistic charting. A shrine world can maintain outward piety while its hinterlands turn lawless, because the sector command must choose between a certainty of disorder and the greater emergency somewhere else. Pacificus teaches that empires do not fail only through invasion. They fail through delay. They fail because knowing is not the same thing as reaching, and reaching is not the same thing as arriving in time. And yet, the region endures. That endurance matters, because Pacificus also reveals why the Imperium has survived as long as it has. Countless worlds remain loyal not because terror is present in any immediate sense, but because local institutions continue to function in terror's absence. Governors still fear the audit of the administratum, even when no inspector has appeared in years. Admirals still keep patrol schedules, because the route must be held whether or not anyone on the throne world knows the names of the ships doing the work. Priesthoods still maintain the rites that keep social order from collapsing into panic. Arbites still administer law. Munitorum officers still count shells, bodies, and grain. Forge worlds still issue replacement parts and sanctified munitions, because war does not pause for administrative uncertainty. The Imperium survives in places like Pacificus because habit becomes doctrine, doctrine becomes identity, and identity becomes a form of resistance. Men do not need to feel terror's hand upon their shoulder to remain bound to it. Often, they remain bound because every structure around them has been built to continue the old obedience long after the living presence of the center has faded into distance. That same truth makes the contrasts of Pacificus especially cruel. Sector capitals glitter with the exhausted majesty of imperial permanence. Star forts hang above worlds like iron crowns. Dock rings blaze with traffic. The great ports throb with naval life, cargo exchange, fleet repair, tithing bureaucracy, and all the stern magnificence of a realm that still believes itself eternal. Yet beyond those nodes lie peripheral systems that may see an imperial cruiser once in a generation. There are worlds that know the Imperium chiefly through old iconography, inherited obligations, and the annual fear that this will be the year the tithe ship does not come, or the year it comes, escorted by guns. There are settlements at the edge of charted confidence where children grow to adulthood, having never once seen the silhouette of a major warship against their sky, and where local authority is so complete that the distant names of segmentum command sound more like scripture than governance. Such worlds are not outside the Imperium. They are among its most truthful reflections. They show what loyalty looks like when it is maintained by memory, by ritual, and by the fear of what waits in the void should the old bonds fail. So Pacificus must be imagined in naval terms, if it is to be imagined correctly. It is columns of shipping crossing the dark beneath escort pennants and coded ident bursts. It is void officers studying casualty returns under dim bridge light. It is the growl of plasma drives and the clatter of cogitator feeds. It is a Lord Captain staring into hololithic uncertainty and deciding which convoy to save, which patrol line to thin, which outlying petition must wait 1 more month, 1 more season, 1 more year. It is mooring towers, repair docks, launch cradles, ammunition scows, transfer stations, and command decks where the language of strategy is spoken through fuel margins and time lost to storm routes. Even Hydrophor, for all its grandeur, does not stand outside this burden. It exists because the burden must be managed somewhere, because the West cannot be watched without a nerve center, because the fleets need a place where orders can be issued, repairs sanctified, officers replaced, and the illusion of comprehensive control renewed. The men who serve there do not command certainty, they administer absence. This is the chapter of tension that Pacificus writes across the Imperium's western marches. In another region, a world dreads the enemy it knows by name. In Pacificus, a world may dread only the silence between messages, and that silence proves just as deadly. Remoteness is not peace. It is simply a wider interval before consequences arrive. A neglected system is not a safe system. It is one that has not yet become urgent enough for the center to notice. A quiet trade lane is not a secure artery. It is a corridor whose raiders may still be gathering. A frontier that appears stable may merely be waiting for the precise conjunction of fleet shortage, warp disruption, and local ambition that will cause the whole arrangement to tear. This is the Western lesson. Distance does not spare. Distance delays, and delay is one of the most faithful servants ruin has ever possessed. Thus, Segmentum Pacificus stands as a revelation rather than a contradiction. It is not quieter than the rest of the Imperium in any meaningful sense. It is only more diffuse in the way its suffering is arranged. Its weakness is stretched thin rather than concentrated. Its fear is dispersed through convoy lanes, outer systems, and the long intervals between commands. Hydra Fur holds it together as best it can. Half forge, half fleet citadel, half bureaucratic knot, a world asked to embody all the structures by which a distant empire pretends that no part of itself is truly distant at all. But the West teaches a hard truth that no segmentum can escape. The Imperium is not strongest where its decrees are loudest. It is strongest where its institutions still function after the voice of terror has grown faint. And where those institutions falter, the dark wastes no time in making their failure permanent. From there, one must turn south. The map may look cleaner there than it does in the haunted north. The wounds may seem less mythic, the frontiers less steeped in the spectacle of eternal siege. Yet that appearance deceives, as all imperial maps deceive. For beyond Pacificus waits Segmentum Tempestus, where war is not diluted by distance so much as processed through fleets, garrisons, convoy chains, and the merciless arithmetic of attrition, and where the Imperium reveals once again that a tidier chart has never once meant a kinder fate. Segmentum Tempestus is rarely granted the same mythic awe that clings to Solar, or the same haunted notoriety that broods over Obscurus, and that is precisely why it matters. It is one of the clearest places in the galaxy to observe the Imperium not as shrine, not as legend, and not as a pageant of sacred memory, but as a war engine grinding through its ordinary state of existence. Here, the Imperium is seen in motion. Here its reality is not the spectacle of one impossible throne world, or the constant gaze into one infamous warp wound, but the daily labor of fleets, garrisons, convoy chains, and command structures trying to keep countless worlds from slipping into fire all at once. Segmentum Tempestus lies to the south of Terra in the Imperium's old reckoning. Its Segmentum fortress is at Bacca, and older imperial geography describes sectors here in the familiar form of administrative cubes measuring roughly 200 light-years on a side. Unlike Obscurus, it is more often defined not by the direct pressure of the Eye of Terror or the Maelstrom, but by Xenos invaders and raiders, by dispersed hostility rather than one singular abyss. That distinction matters because Tempestus strips away illusion. In other regions, war can be narrated as martyrdom, apocalypse, or revelation. In Tempestus, war often appears in its most habitual and administrative form. A frontier reports raids, a subsector requests reinforcement, a convoy is rerouted, a battle fleet is drawn off to meet a fresh incursion, a regiment is landed, expended, and replaced before its casualties have even been fully entered into the ledgers of the Munitorum. The wars here are no less savage for being less famous. They are perhaps more revealing for that very reason. Famous campaigns are the moments history chooses to illuminate. Tempestus is where one sees what the Imperium does in all the unlit years between such moments, when no grand title has yet been granted to the slaughter, and when the outcome, however bloody, may still be filed as a regional matter beneath the correct seals and docket numbers. At the center of this southern mechanism stands Bacca. It is not celebrated because it inspires poetry. It is important because it functions. As Segmentum Fortress and Segmentum Command for Tempestus, and as a forge world as well, Bacca embodies the truth that Imperial war is sustained by coordination, throughput, and continuity more than by splendor. Fleets require a hinge upon which they turn. Convoys require a point of issue and recall. Administrators require a place where requests become orders, where losses become replacement schedules, where munitions, machine parts, escorts, and strategic priorities are measured against one another beneath the pressure of an always incomplete picture. Bacca is that hinge. It is the southern hardpoint where the needs of the fleet, the output of industry, and the habits of the administratum knot together into something capable of moving force across a segmentum whose wars do not stop long enough for anyone to pretend that peace is imminent. Tempestus is also the place where the Imperium's scales of command can be understood with unusual clarity. The hierarchy that elsewhere seems abstract becomes brutally practical here. Segmentum gives way to sector, sector to subsector, subsector to system, and system to world, not because the galaxy is tidy, but because war demands categories. A sector imagined as a cube of roughly 200 light-years on a side is not a geometric nicety. It is an attempt to place a piece of the void within manageable jurisdiction, to say that these worlds, these routes, these tithe burdens, these patrol obligations, and these emergency signals belong to one chain of command before they rise to the next. In Tempestus, where conflicts are numerous, dispersed, and often regional rather than singularly apocalyptic, the administrative box becomes visible as a military instrument. It is how the Imperium decides who is responsible, who must answer, and which deaths will be counted as local expenditure before they are judged sufficient to warrant wider intervention. That is why the enemies of Tempestus matter so much to its character. The region is pressured by dispersed threats. Xenos incursions, raiders, border wars, and flare-ups of violence shape the segmentum's mood far more than any single immortal gate of terror. The danger may come from an orc migration rolling out of the dark, from alien raiders striking shipping and vanishing before pursuit can gather, from ancient powers stirring beneath worlds once judged secure, or from a frontier that simply never had enough ships, enough men, or enough certainty to be called settled in the first place. In Tempestus, the Imperium is not usually staring at one legendary mouth of hell. It is turning in all directions at once, finding threats in the periphery, in the hinterlands, in the shipping lanes, in the overlooked systems, and in the wilderness spaces that border or perforate its claim to authority. The pressure is diffuse, and that makes it constant. This is where the difference between the Imperium's famous wars and its normal condition becomes impossible to ignore. The normal condition is not one climactic crusade followed by order restored. The normal condition is endless regional conflict processed through fleets, regiments, and supply chains. Imperial Guard regiments are recruited from worlds across the Imperium and shipped to war zones across the galaxy. Sector authorities, battle fleets, and local commands absorb the shock of recurring violence, redistribute force, and attempt to prevent one burning system from igniting the next. If a celebrated crusade is the hammer blow that enters history, then Tempestus is the grinding of the gears that made the hammer possible and continue turning long after the cheering dies. Here, war is not an interruption of government. It is one of the main forms government takes. The men who serve in such a region do not imagine an end to conflict. They imagine only the next redeployment, the next replenishment, the next line on the chart, where instability has become costly enough to demand attention. The rhythm of Tempestus is therefore harsh, industrial, and pitilessly repetitive. It is convoys under escort. It is troop worlds and mustering stations. It is relay hubs through which authority passes in 1,000 stamped and sanctified fragments. It is forge output measured against battlefield depletion. It is transport hulls packed with fresh regiments whose officers have not yet learned how quickly their men can disappear beneath artillery, predation, or void loss. It is reserve ammunition shifted from one theatre to another, because the shells must exist where the need is most immediate, even if that means some other world will go wanting. Tempestus feels less like a shrine to human dominion than like the interior of a colossal engine room, hot with overwork and fed by constant sacrifice. Nothing in such a region runs clean. Everything is stained by use. Everything is late by the time it arrives. Everything that survives does so because someone somewhere accepted a deficit in blood, material, or time and judged it preferable to collapse. For that reason, to call Tempestus quieter by chaos standards is not to call it merciful. Worlds still burn here. Populations still vanish. Convoys are still gutted in the dark. Outlying systems still send pleas that arrive too late, or arrive only to be measured against emergencies elsewhere and placed lower on the scale of response. A commander in Tempestus may spend 10,000 lives to buy 3 weeks of stability for a sector corridor, because 3 weeks is enough time for a relief column to form, for a harvest convoy to clear danger, or for an evacuation to move one more tier of useful personnel off a dying world. Stability in the Imperium is often nothing more than time purchased at grotesque cost, and Tempestus reveals that arithmetic in a form almost too plain to romanticize. Here there is often no legendary wall, no final gate, no singular last stand to crown the slaughter with poetry. There is only the cold calculation that this force must be spent here so that another collapse may be delayed elsewhere. Imperial doctrine, when stripped of heroic illumination, looks very much like Tempestus. It looks like naval dispatches and competing command jurisdictions. It looks like reinforcement delays, fleet commitments, fuel constraints, and the long shadow cast by every decision to prioritize one sector over another. It looks like an admiral deciding which patrol line may be thinned without inviting disaster, a munitorum official deciding which army group receives the next shipment of armor, a governor pleading for protection while knowing that a dozen neighboring worlds may be doing the same, and a clerk somewhere reducing all of that fear to coded categories fit for transmission. This is doctrine in practice, not the proclamation, but the distribution, not the vow, but the ration, not the banner raised over the charge, but the ledger that determines whether the charge can be supplied at all. Tempestus is useful precisely because it shows that the Imperium's immense military culture rests not only on fury and faith, but on triage. Thus, the southern segmentum stands as the war engine in one of its clearest forms. Bacca anchors it. The sector boxes give shape to it. The dispersed Xenos pressure keeps it in motion. The fleets and convoys sustain it. The regiments feed it. The relay networks, mustering stations, and command tiers attempt to stop it from tearing itself apart under the weight of simultaneous need. Tempestus may not always dominate the mythic imagination of the age, but that is because it reflects a truth too constant to be dramatic. It shows the Imperium not at its most singular, but at its most typical. And in a galaxy like this, the typical state of mankind is mobilization without end. Yet even Tempestus, for all its structure, does not exhaust the meaning of imperial scale. There remains a province so large that the mind begins to lose its grip upon proportion, a realm where frontier, empire, Xenos power, crusade corridor, and civilizational sprawl all exist at such magnitude that even the segmentum framework starts to feel like an inadequate gesture against immensity. To go there is to leave behind the harsh comprehensibility of the Southern War engine and step into something broader, stranger, and almost absurd in size. That is Ultima Segmentum, the vast eastern reach, and it is there that the Imperium ceases to feel merely overextended and begins to feel truly continental in its madness. By comparison with Ultima, even Tempestus can seem almost disciplined, almost containable, almost known. Ultima Segmentum is where the Imperium ceases to feel like a state and begins to feel like a continent of wars spread across the stars. It lies to the galactic east of Terra. It is the largest of the 5 great segmenti by far, and it contains within its immensity not only the ordered realm of Ultramar, but also the Tau Empire, while the eastern fringe presses against its limits like a constant reminder that the Emperor's map never reaches the end of uncertainty. In the age after the Great Rift, much of this eastern vastness is bound into Imperium Nihilus, and that fact alone tells you what Ultima truly is. Not merely a region, but an overburdened horizon where imperial scale and imperial helplessness become almost the same thing. At the heart of this impossible breadth stands Kar Dunyash, the segmentum fortress of Ultima, a naval bastion and command world tasked with anchoring a region so enormous that even its own orders seem forced to cross a storm before they can matter. Like every segmentum fortress, it exists as a fleet base and administrative hardpoint, yet in Ultima that role takes on a special strain, because command here can never feel intimate. It can only feel projected. Signals go out, orders are issued, fleet dispositions are made. But across such an expanse, authority does not descend cleanly. It echoes, fractures, arrives late, or reaches a war zone already transformed by delay. Kar Dunyash does not rule a quiet dominion. It shouts across distance and hopes the answer comes back in time to be useful. And still, within this immensity, there are places where the old imperial dream seems almost to hold. Ultramar is the clearest of them. It is not important merely because it is the domain of the Ultramarines. It matters because it offers one of the most vivid examples in the galaxy of a comparatively ordered imperial sphere, enduring within a wider universe built on disorder. Even your own source material understands what Ultramar signifies, describing a lesser regional power as a dim reflection of fair Ultramar in the galactic East, which is precisely how the wider Imperium has long looked upon it, as an image of what disciplined governance, strong defense, and inherited structure can still achieve when so much else has been surrendered to attrition and decay. Yet that very contrast makes Ultramar feel less like proof that the Imperium works, and more like proof of how exceptional any functioning order has become. Set against that stands the Tau Empire and the Eastern Fringe, and together they make Ultima the ideal place to understand collision. This is not only collision between armies, but between assumptions. Imperial certainty does not meet empty wilderness here. It meets alien polities, rival visions of order, scattered frontier societies, and whole regions where the Astronomicon weakens and the old structures of command thin out into danger. The Eastern Fringe is adjacent to rather than formally within Ultima, yet it presses so closely upon its meaning that the border becomes almost academic. Here lie dispersed human colonies, Xenos domains, and frontier systems so remote that the Imperium's claim to them is often sustained more by memory and occasional violence than by any continuous presence. In such places, the Tau Empire becomes more than an enemy. It becomes a sign that the Eastern Marches are not vacant ground waiting to be reclaimed, but contested futures in which mankind's monopoly on certainty has already failed. The Great Rift made this worse in the most intimate way possible. Ultima was already too large for comfort, already too wide for any central authority to feel immediate. Then the galaxy was torn open, and much of the segmentum was thrust into the wider darkness of Imperium Nihilus, where the light of the Astronomicon could no longer be trusted. Warp travel became still more perilous, and astropathic communication faltered into fragments, screams, and absences. In another segmentum, such a wound might feel like a crisis imposed from without. In Ultima, it felt like an existing difficulty made final. Worlds that were already impossibly far apart became spiritually and strategically estranged as well. Regions that had once been merely distant became functionally isolated. Fleets that once depended on delay now faced disappearance. The scale had always been oppressive. The rift made it predatory. That is why Ultima feels like the future-facing face of the age, not hopeful, not progressive, simply forward exposed. This is where expansion fronts and collapsing frontiers exist in the same breath. This is where major Xenos powers stand close enough to Imperial space to force adaptation, whether Terra approves or not. This is where old assumptions fail most visibly, because the old assumptions were built for a realm that could still imagine the Astronomicon as universal, reinforcement as eventual certainty, and command as something that flowed outward with enough force to stay command. Your source material captures that Eastern instability with unusual clarity when it describes frontier worlds so remote that Imperial patrols are reluctant to risk venturing that far from the Astronomicon, and settlements so cut off that they evolve into self-sustaining society states by necessity. That is Ultima in miniature, not the failure of faith, but the failure of reach. So the size of Ultima becomes the purest expression of Imperial weakness. 1,000,000 worlds means nothing if relief fleets arrive too late. A segmentum fortress means little if its orders vanish into warp storm and silence. Great sectors, subsectors, and command networks become ceremonial gestures when the distances between them are measured not only in light years, but in damaged ducts, collapsed routes, and time itself turning treacherous. One of your uploaded texts speaks of a wide swathe of Ultima segmentum linked by astra-telepathica ducts, those unstable channels by which astropathic communication sometimes gains a fraction more reliability through pattern and chance. Another shows just how fragile such links are when worlds on the frontier drift toward isolation, sustained by their own resources, because broader Imperial contact has become infrequent or dangerous. This is the Eastern truth. Local rulers become their own last authority, not because they desire secession, but because the galaxy has made dependence suicidal. And yet for all that fragmentation, Ultima does not feel empty. It feels swollen. Rich worlds and dead worlds sit within the same strategic imagination. Hive clusters feed nearby systems until war or depletion breaks them. Forge worlds arm armies that may die elsewhere in the segmentum before their masters ever see the smoke. Penal worlds, shipyard fortresses, counter-piracy stations, and local battle fleets hold together subsector pockets of order. Your own reference material paints this abundance and fracture perfectly in the Krythe cluster, described as an Imperial micro-realm in the east, with hive worlds, an agri-world, a forge world, a starfort world, local fleet power, and counter-piracy deployments, all bound together by profit, defense, and vulnerability. That is Ultima, in essence, not one frontier, but 1,000 little empires within the Imperium, all trying to remain coherent, while the dark between them waits for a convoy to fail, or a warning to arrive late. So when viewed beside the other great divisions of mankind, Ultima becomes the final answer to the question with which we began. The 5 segmenti are not clean compartments. They are 5 different ways the Imperium tries and fails to master the same collapsing galaxy. Solar is the pressure of the center. Obscurus is the habit of siege beneath the eye's shadow. Pacificus is distance stretched thin into administration. Tempestus is war processed as routine by fleets and ledgers. Ultima is scale driven to the edge of absurdity, where ordered domains like Ultramar exist beside frontier instability, alien powers, isolated colonies, dead roots, and the dark half of the Imperium itself. The divisions are real enough to organize fleets and tithes. They are never real enough to save mankind from the consequences of its own size. And that is the final truth of every Imperial map. It is a memorial in advance. It is not a record of what mankind securely rules. It is a record of what it is still desperately trying not to lose. Even the Imperium's own inner logic understands this. Your notes speak of honored memorials as a useful fiction, a way to turn failure into fuel, and of an empire whose survivors are less victors than administrators of decline. That is the hidden script beneath every segmentum border, every sector notation, every fortress seal, every fleet corridor, and every name inked onto the parchment skin of the stars. The galaxy is not mastered. It is catalogued while it burns. And in the far east of the Emperor's realm, where Ultima Segmentum spreads like a wounded continent beneath a broken heaven, that truth can no longer be mistaken for anything else.